The story of General George S. Patton and General Dwight D. Eisenhower is one of the most complicated relationships in American military history, a mixture of respect, frustration, admiration, and emotional collisions that defined a turning point in World War II. What happened when Eisenhower suspended Patton wasn't simply a disciplinary action. It was a moment filled with storm-like emotions, wounded pride, loyalty under pressure, and the weight of the entire Allied cause pressing on the shoulders of two men who were both trying, in their own very different ways, to win a global war. To understand what Patton said in that moment, we must first step into the emotional battlefield each man carried inside him. Eisenhower was the calm diplomat, the steady strategist, the man chosen to lead the Allied forces not because he was the loudest voice, but because he could get other powerful men, British, American, and otherwise, to work together. Patton, on the other hand, was lightning in human form, brilliant, aggressive, impulsive, and deeply emotional. He lived for action, for the roar of engines, for the thunder of tanks. Eisenhower needed Patton's fire, but sometimes he also feared how hot that fire could burn when it escaped its boundaries. The breaking point came after the incidents in Sicily. Patton's behavior with two soldiers suffering from battle-related exhaustion became international news and caused a storm of criticism across both the military and the civilian front. Newspapers ran the story with shock and condemnation. Members of Congress demanded disciplinary action. Public outrage grew like wildfire. Across the Atlantic, Eisenhower felt the pressure building from politicians, analysts, and officers who believed Patton's temper had gone too far. And yet, Patton was still one of the greatest assets the Allies had. When Eisenhower wrote the letter suspending Patton from his command responsibilities, he didn't do it lightly. His hand trembled slightly as he signed the bottom, a sign of the emotional exhaustion weighing on him. He admired Patton deeply. He valued his gift for inspiring troops. He knew Patton could break Germany's defenses like few others could. But at that moment, he also knew he had to choose between protecting the Allied image and protecting Patton. He chose the war. And when Patton received the message, the anger rose in him like an uncontrolled tide. He sat at his desk, the letter open in his hands, reading the words again and again, each sentence cutting into his pride. His face flushed red, and his jaw tightened as if he were bracing himself against an enemy he didn't expect to fight. For years he had trained, sacrificed, pushed his body and mind to the limit to be ready for a moment like this. And now, he was being sidelined, not by the Germans, not by military failure, but by discipline, politics, and public opinion. But beneath his anger, another emotion simmered, hurt, deep, personal hurt. Because the order didn't come from a bureaucrat. It came from Eisenhower, the man he respected more than anyone in the chain of command, the man he had followed willingly, the man he believed understood him better than the rest. For several minutes, he said nothing. The officers around him waited, silent, watching Patton wage an internal battle more ferocious than any artillery barrage. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, not calm, but controlled, as though he were trying to contain a storm. "So," he said quietly, "Ike has decided to clip my wings." The room stayed silent, because every officer present felt the weight of the moment. Patton stood from his chair and paced slowly, the letter still in his hand. He kept reading it, as if expecting the words to change. Suspended, relieved of operational command. Patton whispered the phrases with disbelief. Then, in an emotional wave that surprised even him, he slammed the letter on the desk and shouted, "How could he do this? How could Eisenhower, of all people, do this to me?" The pain in his voice wasn't simply professional. It was personal. It was the cry of a man who felt betrayed by someone he considered a friend, as much as a superior. And yet, after several moments of venting, Patton did something unexpected. He grew quiet. He lowered himself back into the chair and stared at the letter again. But this time with a different expression, one that mixed frustration, reflection, and something close to regret. "I suppose," he muttered softly, "I suppose I brought this on myself." Those words were the first sign of the introspection buried deep inside Patton's fiery personality. Behind the toughness, he was a man who studied himself, who wrestled with his own flaws. who knew that greatness came with responsibility. And in that moment, he knew he had crossed a line, even if he hated admitting it. His personal diary from that period reflects a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the suspension, sadness at losing control of troops he loved, fear that his military career might be over, and an aching sense of disappointment in himself. He blamed the newspapers. He blamed politics. But perhaps most painfully of all, he blamed his own inability to control his temper. When Eisenhower and Patton finally met face-to-face days later, the air between them felt thick with unsaid words. Eisenhower greeted him first, calm but firm. Patton saluted stiffly, holding his emotions tightly inside. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Eisenhower sighed, the weight of command heavy in his voice, and said, "George, you know why this had to happen." Patton didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened. His eyes gleamed with restrained emotion. Finally, he said, "Ike, I've given everything, to this war. To be taken out of the fight now? It feels like a punishment I can't accept." Eisenhower didn't look away. "It's not punishment. It's survival. This war is bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than any of us. You crossed a line, and the world saw it. I had to act." Patton exhaled slowly, trembling slightly. "I never meant to damage the cause," he said. "I never meant to embarrass the command. I've always believed, always, that I was born to lead soldiers. And now I'm being told I can't do the one thing I was meant for." For the first time, Eisenhower softened. His voice lowered. "George, you are still one of my greatest commanders. But you must learn restraint. You must. Because if you don't, the war won't be the only thing you lose." Patton nodded, the words sinking deep. Then he said something that revealed the emotional truth beating inside him, words he would later repeat in letters and diary entries. "Ike," he whispered, "I know I'm flawed. I know I'm hot-headed. But never, never doubt my loyalty to you or to this country. I would die before I let either down." Those words carried a heavy emotional truth. For all of Patton's fire and fury, his loyalty to Eisenhower was unshakable. He respected Ike as a commander and admired him as a leader who could unite people in ways Patton himself never could. The suspension hurt because it came from someone he cared about. It hurt because the man he admired had been forced to discipline him. And yet what Patton said next is what defined his character more than anything else. After venting, after expressing frustration and hurt, after confronting Eisenhower with raw honesty, he eventually said the words Eisenhower needed to hear, but didn't expect to hear so soon. "If this is what you need me to do," Patton said softly, "then I will do it. I will step back. I will accept the consequences. But when the time comes, when you need me again, you know I'll be ready. And I'll fight harder than ever." Eisenhower nodded slowly, relief mixed with lingering concern. He placed a hand on Patton's shoulder. "I don't want you out of the war forever, George. I just need you to show the world that you can be the leader I know you are." Patton didn't smile. He didn't show triumph. He simply nodded, accepting the reality of the moment, even though it broke something inside him. And as he left the room, he said quietly, almost too quietly for Eisenhower to hear, "I won't fail you again. Not if I can help it." But in private, Patton wrote a different sentiment in his diary, words that revealed the deep emotional storm still raging inside him. "I have been humiliated," he wrote. "Unjustly, perhaps, but I will endure. I must endure, because history will judge me not for my punishment, but for what I do after it." The suspension changed him. It humbled him without extinguishing his fire. It forced him to confront his flaws without dulling his brilliance. Over time, it taught him restraint, even though he would never fully master it. But his emotional journey was only beginning, because the world still needed him. Eisenhower still needed him, and history would soon call upon Patton once again, at a moment when the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The days following Patton's suspension were some of the darkest and most emotionally conflicted moments of his entire life. For the first time since he was a young cadet, his future in the army felt uncertain. The war went on without him. The tanks rolled across Europe. The infantry marched toward new objectives, and the newspapers shifted their focus to other events. But for Patton, time felt as if it had stopped completely. His mind became a battlefield of self-doubt, pride, regret, and an almost desperate desire for redemption. He spent the first few nights awake, pacing his temporary quarters in silence, the air thick with the smell of old paper, oil from his weapons, and the cold draft that crept through the walls. His uniform hung in the corner like a reminder of what he had been, what he still wanted to be. But at that moment, he felt reduced, sidelined, almost invisible. Many men feared being wounded in battle. Patton feared irrelevance. To him, being removed from command was a wound to the soul, one that no bandage could fix. His staff officers walked on eggshells around him, unsure whether to offer comfort or keep their distance. They admired him, respected him, feared him, and now, more than ever, they felt protective of him. They had never seen the general like this. They had seen him furious. They had seen him commanding. They had seen him unstoppable. But they had never seen him quiet. Never seen him walking slowly, head lowered, as if weighed down by the very silence he once filled with thunder. Sometimes, late at night, Patton would sit alone with a dim lamp burning beside him, reading letters from soldiers of the 7th Army, men who had fought under him, men who believed in him, men who had written words of gratitude and admiration. He traced their signatures with his fingertip as if to remind himself that he was still needed, that he still mattered, that his leadership had meant something. And every now and then, he whispered to himself, "They still need me. They still need me." But he knew that needing wasn't enough. Eisenhower had placed him on the sidelines. And until the Supreme Commander felt the world could trust Patton again, he would remain there. That truth pierced him deeper than any criticism from reporters or politicians. One morning, after several days of silence, Patton decided to write to Eisenhower directly. The letter began stiffly, emotionally guarded. "Dear Ike, I acknowledge receipt of your directive and understand the necessity, as you see it." But as the words flowed, Patton's pride seeped into the page. He wrote about honor, about duty, about the weight of war, and about how he regretted the embarrassment he had caused the command. But he also wrote that he hoped, deeply, that this would not mark the end of his ability to serve. And then, at the end, he added a line that revealed everything he felt inside. A line he wrote without overthinking. A line that came purely from emotion. "No man desires to return to the fight more than I do, and I stand ready when you call." When Eisenhower read the letter, he felt a mix of relief and sadness. He could see Patton's heart poured onto the page, and it softened him. Eisenhower always understood Patton more than he let on. He knew that beneath Patton's aggressive, unfiltered exterior was a man who cared deeply, perhaps too deeply. A man who loved his troops. A man who believed he had been born for war. A man who felt sidelining him was equivalent to stripping him of purpose. Yet, even with the emotional letter, Eisenhower knew the suspension had to stand. The world had seen Patton's outbursts. The Allied command had to protect its reputation, and Patton needed time to understand the consequences of letting his temper overpower his judgment. But Patton, during his suspension, didn't simply wallow. He studied. He read military history late into the nights. He analyzed German movements, feeding reports to friends in the intelligence branch. He wrote long reflections in his diary about leadership, discipline, and courage. He even found himself revisiting his own past, searching for the roots of his fiery temperament. He admitted to himself, though only in private, that if he ever returned to command, he needed to prove to the world that he could balance passion with discipline. Meanwhile, the war pressed forward. Sicily had been secured. New strategies were forming for mainland Italy. Rumors buzzed throughout the Allied ranks about where the next major push would occur. And everywhere Patton went, soldiers would salute him, sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with confusion, but always with respect. They had heard about the suspension. Soldiers always heard everything. And though some questioned his temper, most still saw him as the man who would lead them to victory faster than anyone else. One afternoon, while sitting outside a makeshift headquarters building, Patton overheard a group of enlisted men speaking quietly nearby. They didn't know he was within earshot. One soldier said, "They can suspend him. They can write about him. But if I had to run across open ground with shells falling all around me, that's the man I would want leading me." The others murmured in agreement. Patton closed his eyes, swallowing hard. Soldiers' trust was the one currency he valued above all else. Hearing those words felt like receiving a medal he hadn't earned. And in that moment, he made himself a promise, one that echoed through his mind loudly enough to chase the Silence away. If I lead again, I will honor their faith. I will not let them down. Not again. But even as he grew more reflective and self-aware, political storms still brewed across the Atlantic. Back in the United States, newspapers continued to question his character. Some commentators called for his removal from the war entirely. Members of Congress debated whether he should be reassigned or disciplined even further. Eisenhower faced enormous pressure to keep Patton away from major roles in upcoming operations. And yet, Eisenhower hesitated, because every general he consulted, every strategist, every frontline commander said the same thing: we'll need Patton eventually. Some said it with pride, others with annoyance. But they all said it. The Germans feared him. American troops rallied behind him. Even British commanders, though occasionally critical of his bluntness and theatrics, admitted that he had the rare ability to shock the enemy with speed and unpredictability. Meanwhile, Patton spent long, quiet evenings staring at maps of Europe spread across his desk. He traced potential invasion routes. He analyzed supply lines. He wrote speculative plans for future offensives. He couldn't help himself. His mind refused to stop approaching the war like he was still in the fight. But every time he looked up, he was reminded of the bitter truth. Those plans weren't being sent to Ike. They weren't being read by other generals. They were just words on paper, plans without authority. Still, the fire inside him didn't die. It simply simmered. But Eisenhower, miles away, wrestled with his own emotional burdens. Suspending Patton had not made his life easier. It had made it significantly more complicated. Allies questioned his decision. Political leaders pressed him for insights into Patton's future. Journalists asked whether Patton was still fit to lead. Eisenhower felt trapped between his duty as supreme commander and his loyalty to a man he knew was one of America's greatest battlefield weapons. Eventually, Eisenhower made a quietly hopeful choice. He didn't restore Patton to command immediately, but he did something that spoke volumes. He kept Patton close. He invited Patton to planning meetings, not as a commander, but as an observer. This was both a gesture of trust and a test of patience. And Patton accepted. Not joyfully, not comfortably, but gratefully. The first time he entered one of these meetings, the room fell silent. Generals from multiple nations watched him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Patton stood tall, ignoring the tension, wearing his polished helmet and stiff uniform like armor. Eisenhower welcomed him with a nod, professional, formal, but warm enough to convey that Patton was not an outcast. Patton nodded back, standing behind the table while the room continued with operational discussions. Throughout the meeting, Patton spoke only when invited. His comments were sharp, insightful, grounded in deep military knowledge. And everyone in the room, friends and critics alike, felt reminded of why the world couldn't afford to waste a mind like his. After the meeting, Eisenhower approached him privately. "George," he said, "I want you to know, I haven't lost faith in you." Patton inhaled slowly, the words hitting him like an emotional blow. "I hope not, Ike. I hope I still have a place when the time comes." Eisenhower placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will, but you must be patient." Patton nodded, though the very word patient felt like an insult to his soul. And yet, for Eisenhower, he tried. For the war, he tried. For the soldiers who still believed in him, he tried. But the emotional storm wasn't over. One night, walking alone under the cold moonlight, Patton stopped in an empty field near headquarters. He stared across the dark horizon and whispered into the night, "Give me another chance, God. Just one, and I will show them all who I am." He wasn't speaking to the wind. He was speaking to himself, to fate, to whatever power controlled the tides of war. And in that lonely moment, his desperation softened into something deeper, hope. And that hope was soon rewarded, because history was building toward a moment when Eisenhower would need Patton again, not just as a soldier, but as the spearhead of an entire campaign. A moment when German intelligence would be watching closely. A moment when deception would be critical. A moment when the Allies would need a general so bold, so unpredictable, so fearsome that even the enemy would tremble at the thought of him being unleashed. Eisenhower didn't know it yet, but soon Patton's suspension would become the foundation for one of the greatest military deceptions of World War II. But before that moment arrived, Patton would have to confront his own doubts, his own pride, and the sweeping tide of world opinion, waiting to see whether he could rise again after being knocked to the ground. The path to redemption had begun, but the world had not yet seen how far Patton would go to reclaim his honor. Patton's path to redemption did not begin with applause, nor with reinstatement, nor even with forgiveness. It began with uncertainty, long, slow, stretching uncertainty. It was the kind of emotional purgatory that ate away at a man like him. For a general built for motion, being held in place felt like being chained. Yet as the weeks passed, a subtle shift took place within him. The fiery anger that had once dominated. His thoughts began cooling into something deeper, something sharper, resolve. He no longer wanted to return to war simply to prove critics wrong. He wanted to return because he still believed. He had a destiny in the fight against tyranny, and though his pride had been wounded, his belief in the mission remained unbroken. During this quieter period, Patton became more introspective than he had ever been in his life. He spent long hours visiting field hospitals, speaking with wounded soldiers, listening to their stories, without the thunder of command, overshadowing the moment. Some of them reached for his hand with tears in their eyes, telling him they wanted to return to battle. Others simply thanked him for inspiring them. Each conversation carved itself into Patton's heart, reminding him that leadership was not only about storms of courage on the battlefield. It was also about understanding the deeper emotions of the men who fought beneath him. And then one afternoon, as Patton stood quietly at the bedside of a young soldier who had lost his leg in Sicily, the soldier looked up and whispered, "General, we're waiting for you. We need you back." Patton swallowed hard, fighting the burning in his throat. He rested a hand on the soldier's shoulder and said softly, "I won't let you down. I will never let you down again." It was a promise born not out of pride, but out of genuine human connection, a promise he intended to keep. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was wrestling with his own anxieties. The political fires surrounding Patton had not died completely, but the noise was fading. Reporters were shifting to other headlines. Commanders in the field were urging Eisenhower to reconsider Patton's future. And German intelligence reports, intercepted by Allied cryptographers, suggested that the enemy was still terrified of Patton. The Germans viewed Patton as America's most aggressive offensive commander. To them, Patton wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of unstoppable momentum. Eisenhower recognized something powerful. Patton's suspension had not diminished his legend. It had enhanced it. When the time came to plan Operation Fortitude, the massive deception operation meant to convince the Germans that the Allies would invade France through Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. Eisenhower knew exactly who he needed. He summoned Patton back to headquarters, not to restore him to battlefield command, but to offer him a role of immense strategic importance. Patton was confused when the invitation arrived. For hours he paced in his quarters, wondering whether this would be another reprimand, another lecture, or the beginning of something more. When he finally entered Eisenhower's office, he stood at attention, his expression disciplined yet faintly hopeful. Eisenhower didn't waste time with small talk. He looked Patton straight in the eye and said, "George, I need you." Patton's heart leaped, but he kept his face still. Eisenhower continued, "Not for battle, not yet, but for something only you can do. The Germans fear you more than any commander we have, and we are going to use that fear." He laid out the plan. Patton would lead a fake army, the first U.S. Army group, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden artillery, fake radio messages, and staged movements. The purpose was clear: convince the Germans that Patton would lead the invasion at Pas-de-Calais. The real invasion would strike at Normandy instead. It was one of the most ambitious deception operations in history. Patton listened silently, absorbing the weight of the mission. He expected to feel insulted. After all, he was being asked to command an army that didn't exist. But instead, he felt something different: purpose. This was not punishment. This was trust. This was Eisenhower, acknowledging that Patton's reputation alone could influence the outcome of the war. When Eisenhower finished speaking, Patton took a deep breath. Then he said something that revealed how deeply the suspension had humbled and shaped him. "Ike," he began quietly, "I'll do whatever the war requires. If my name can help win this fight, even if I never fire a shot, then I will serve without complaint." Eisenhower exhaled slowly, relieved. In that moment, he knew Patton had truly grown. Not changed. Patton would always be Patton, but matured, sharpened, refined, and thus began the strangest chapter of Patton's military career, leading a ghost army. In the weeks that followed, Patton threw himself into the deception operation with surprising enthusiasm. He gave speeches to the fake divisions, knowing German spies were listening. He staged inspections, reviewed phantom troops, and rode around in his jeep with all the intensity of a real commander. His mere presence near Dover sent a shockwave through German intelligence. They tracked every move he made, convinced that when the invasion came, Patton would be at the center. He became the centerpiece of one of the greatest strategic illusions in history. Still, beneath the surface, Patton longed to return to real command. Some nights, after playing his role for the day, he would sit quietly in his quarters staring at maps of France, imagining himself breaching German defenses, imagining tanks rolling beneath his command once again. Each night, he whispered the same vow. When they unleash me, I'll make up for every second I've been gone. And then June 6, 1944, D-Day, arrived. Patton was not there. His tanks did not lead the charge. His troops did not storm the beaches. But the deception worked brilliantly. German commanders held their strongest forces in the north, waiting for Patton. They refused to believe Normandy was the real invasion. In their minds, Patton was the threat. Patton was the hammer. Patton was the storm on the horizon. And ironically, in being suspended, Patton had helped save thousands of Allied lives. A few weeks later, after the landings succeeded and the beachheads were secure, Eisenhower called Patton to headquarters once more. This time, Patton's heart pounded with anticipation. He knew this wasn't another meeting about deception. Something was different. Eisenhower's message had been brief, almost urgent. When he entered the room, Eisenhower smiled slightly, a smile Patton hadn't seen since before the suspension. "George," he said, "it's time." Patton stood frozen, afraid to hope too quickly. "Time for what, sir?" Eisenhower stepped toward him. "Time to get back into the fight." Those words hit Patton like a bolt of lightning. The fire that had been simmering inside him for months erupted into fierce, determined energy. He straightened his uniform, shoulders back, chin up, every muscle in his body tightening with anticipation. "Ike," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I won't fail you. Not this time. Not ever again." Eisenhower nodded. "I know you won't. That's why I'm giving you the Third Army." The gravity of that moment was overwhelming. Patton had dreamed of this command. He had prayed for a chance like this. The Third Army was not only powerful, it was key to the next phase of the war. And Eisenhower was handing it to him, not out of desperation, not out of obligation, but out of trust. Patton took a long, steady breath and said softly, "Thank you, Ike, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you." Then, almost as an emotional confession, he added, "I know what my temper cost me. I know I let you down. That won't happen again. I've learned. I've changed. I'm still the same fighter, but I understand myself better now." Eisenhower looked at him with a mixture of pride and worry. "George, I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to win." Patton nodded. "Then I will win. I swear it." And he did. In the months that followed, Patton unleashed a campaign of such breathtaking speed and precision that historians still marvel at it. Tanks swept across France in lightning advances. Entire German divisions collapsed under the pressure of his maneuvers. He shocked the enemy, inspired his troops, and proved that his brilliance had not faded during suspension, it had sharpened. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans launched a surprise offensive in December 1944. Eisenhower gathered his commanders to discuss the crisis, and many struggled to offer solutions. Patton stepped forward, calm and confident, and said, "Give me 3 days, Ike. I'll pivot the Third Army north and break through to Bastogne." The room fell silent. Eisenhower looked at him, eyes wide. "You can't move that fast," another general said. "No army can." Patton simply replied, "Watch me." And he did it. In that moment, every doubt Eisenhower had ever felt faded away. Patton had redeemed himself not through words, but through action, through overwhelming, undeniable success. His suspension was no longer a stain. It had become part of his journey, a chapter of humility that shaped the man he ultimately became. Years later, reflecting privately on the suspension, Patton wrote something few people know. "Eisenhower saved me from myself. I didn't see it then. I see it now. He did what a true commander must do, even when it hurts. And what Patton said publicly when asked about Eisenhower was this: "With all my flaws, with all my fire, Ike never gave up on me. And that is why I would march through hell itself for him." Their relationship remained imperfect, emotional, and complex. But it was real. It was human. And in the crucible of war, it formed one of the most powerful partnerships in military history.